Hello, and welcome to the seminar on global economy and inequality. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm recording this seminar on the land of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples, and I want to pay my respect to the traditional owners of this land, and also acknowledge that this land was never ceded, but stolen from them. My name is Elliot Dolan-Evans. I'm primarily a political economist who does research in political economy, but I also work in a few different faculties across a couple of universities here in Melbourne. I'm an assistant lecturer in anatomy at the Faculty of Medicine at Monash University. I'm also a sessional tutor at Monash University in the arts faculty, sometimes in the law faculty as well. And I'm also a sessional tutor at La Trobe University. I also have done quite a bit of volunteer work as a lawyer in community practice. And a couple of years ago, I finished my PhD in political economy, where I investigated the impact of international financial institution-led reforms during war. And my case study for that particular investigation was Ukraine, and I've been continuing that research since. So today we have a few different learning objectives to get through. These are very broad in scope and are also very complex and difficult topics. And so what I'll try to do is address these objectives in turn and then try to link the main ideas that come through each one individually, so that hopefully by the end of the seminar, you'll have a really good idea of what exactly is the global economy and how does it lead to inequality. So first, we want to identify what exactly is the global economy, who are the main players, the actors in the global economy, and how it works. Second, we want to critically reflect on how the global economy produces inequality. And thirdly, identify the role of artificial intelligence in the global economy, which has become a very topical issue in recent months and years. So let's start by discussing what exactly is the global economy. So if we want to try to define the global economy, there's different ways of going about this. And so what is often seen as the global economy is more or less international trade. So international trade that occurs either between people in various countries, or between corporations, or between states themselves. What political economists often refer to as the global economy is usually a bit more of a holistic concept, which is multi-scalar in that it seeks to understand the interaction and influence of local, regional, national, and then international economies working together, and to understand how they are exactly interconnected. So when we talk about the global economy, we certainly also refer to factors such as international trade between countries, corporations, and people across borders, but also economies that are both nationally defined, regionally, and also locally defined. So this is what we call a multi-scalar view of the global economy. And this also means that when we see particular political economy forces working at the international level, so for example, when we see internationally a heightened cost of gas, which for instance might be the result of reduced supply, increased demand, or other disruptions like we are experiencing now, we seek to try to understand how this international change radiates down to various other scales of the global economy. So how heightened gas prices in international trade then filters down to impact local markets, whether that might be the local household price of gas, for instance, or the cost of food, which increases because transport costs are more expensive as gas skyrockets in price. So again, we have a multi-scalar view of the global economy. And as I've hinted with that kind of discussion, it's interconnected. So when one thing happens in one part of the global economy, it radiates and moves throughout all the other scales of the global economy. So in the global economy, we have kind of a few different kind of main activities, and a lot of this kind of revolves around trade. So I've given the example of gas trading, for instance, but there's even more simple trades that occur on the global economy. So for example, if you want to buy a commodity, whether it might be a textbook or an item of clothing, or possibly even a car from overseas, you're interacting in the international aspect of the global economy to conduct a trade across international borders. And then this commodity will be sent to you, and you'll hopefully receive it successfully. So this is an example of a simple trade, which is one of the main activities that occur on the global economy. Trades can also be a lot more complex, and this is something that we won't be able to go into too much detail in this seminar, but this might include, for example, future contracts, which is more or less where a buyer, so for instance, if you are an investor or a buyer on international markets who is interested in wheat, as one particular example that has been topical recently, you might place a bet on how much wheat might be priced in, say, a month's time, and you will purchase a contract to receive wheat in a month's time at a certain price, which you think will net you a profit when that month expires. So this is future trading. It's a much more complex type of trade in the global economy, and one that we won't focus on in too much detail here. So just to recap again, the global economy is multi-scalar, it's interconnected, and allows us primarily to trade commodities across national economies. Again, as I've hinted at through this discussion so far, there are several different actors in the global economy. For instance, individuals like you or I would be actors in the global economy. We purchase things either in local, national, international markets. So we are obviously make up a large component of the global economy. Corporations are another important component of the global economy, and their importance has grown substantially over time. Especially from about the 1970s onwards, corporations have become major actors in not only the global economy itself, but also shaping the kind of practice and outline of what even is a global economy. And this is something we will briefly touch on when we discuss the evolution of the global economy since the end of World War II. States are also a main actor in the global economy. Their role has arguably decreased in direct importance compared to, for example, about 100 years ago. However, as I'll discuss more soon, states are really fundamental to maintaining the proper functioning of the global economy, even though their role has changed in that particular function. And also another important actor in the global economy, and one that I'll touch on a bit more soon, are international organizations. So many of you have probably heard of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, for example. There's also international organizations that are involved directly in the global economy. And these include the World Trade Organization that seeks to establish kind of rules to more interconnect national economies and promote increased efficiency in trading, for instance, as well as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, who we will take an interest in and discuss at length in a few slides' time. So these are some of the main actors in the global economy. And again, the global economy being something that's multiscalar, interconnected, and helps us, trade commodities between each other and across borders. So what defines the global economy, or what we might kind of describe the global economy being, is one that is a capitalist global economy. So when we talk about capitalism and what a capitalist global economy is, this is actually quite a complicated question, and one that also changes and has changed in time. We can't go into an entire history of capitalism in this seminar, but it's important to have a brief understanding of this term, as capitalism is more or less can be considered the global economy, and can be used as an interchangeable term for the global economy in some respects. Capitalism has had a long development since coming to the fore as a kind of integrative program of political and economical functioning since about the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, and has changed substantially since that time to today's global economy. But at the center of capitalism is that it's a kind of a term to encapsulate the entire global economy, where the main driving process of actors in the global economy is the accumulation of profit through growth. So capitalism has an inherent drive to increase, to produce, and to profit, and to constantly expand. Again, this has taken many different forms over the history of capitalism, and we will discuss a few different capitalist forms that have emerged in the wake of World War II, and what kind of capitalism enlivens the present. So capitalism defines and structures the global economy. That profit motive is central for corporations and individuals to interact together in the global economy. And we'll soon find out how historically the forces behind capitalism have engendered or made the global economy as we understand it today. Now we're going to dive in a little bit more detail to a few actors that I've described so far in the global economy, because it will help us understand the structure and function of this global economy in a bit more detail. So we'll firstly start talking about states. So states are a very important part of the global economy, as I've hinted at before, though their role has changed quite substantially, over the last few hundred years. One of the aspects of states' engagement in the global economy that has maintained relative stability is that states generally have a specialized commodity or specialized commodities that they produce and seek to trade. So, for example, Australia is a country that focuses on producing and then exporting minerals such as iron ore, as well as other fossil fuel commodities such as gas, and also has certain agricultural products that it specializes in. So Australia specializes in producing these commodities, and it seeks to export them to countries that don't produce these commodities in sufficient amounts, and then earn money trading them in the international market. So countries have specialized commodities that they produce and trade. Many mainstream analysis of the global political economy see this as a natural process, where countries just naturally are better placed to do certain things, whether it's by the climate, the people within the country themselves, or other factors. But often it is seen as something that is natural and occurs as the global economy has expanded to every corner of the earth. However, the ability for countries to specialize in certain commodities has been very much based on their history. And this is particularly true of countries that have undergone colonialism. They have been very much directed and influenced into certain specialization of commodities from a colonial inheritance. So, for example, and we can't touch on this in too much detail, but when imperial powers such as England, France, and Spain expanded their direct power and influence across the known world and set up colonies in various different places, they basically enforced the local people in these places to produce certain commodities. So, for instance, in Central America, this may have been things like sugar or coffee or other spices that couldn't be grown in England because of potentially the climate, because of the labor involved, or even the space and other geographical factors. But these parts of the world which were colonized and enforced to specialize in certain commodities, usually under pain of labor through slavery or other exploitative conditions, they focused on producing just a handful of goods. So after colonialism ended, or formally ended, usually around the time of World War II and a little bit after, many of these ex-colonies, which then became countries in previously colonized areas, still had these specialized commodities as the basis of their economy. So even today, many Central American countries specialize in producing coffee and exporting it on the world market, as they do specialize in products such as maize or sugar or other similar items. And because of the colonial inheritance that their country was originally specialized to produce these particular commodities, and that certain relationships of power and exploitation has developed to cement those relationships within the country. Even after independence, they still have specialized in these particular commodities for export into the global market. So this specialization of commodities is something that has a really intensive historical basis and is not something that has arisen naturally. Now, once countries produce certain commodities, and these days, of course, most of the commodities and products that are made within a country are usually carried out by private actors, such as multinational corporations or local companies. These are then produced to then trade, either internally in the country itself on national, regional, or local markets, or in international markets. So as we mentioned in an earlier slide, trade is a really important part of the global economy. And this is where countries or corporations within countries try to get currency for their products. And because, again, of colonial legacies and the position of certain countries in the global economy, trading commodities is one of the major ways that most countries receive an income or are able to receive foreign money, which is really important in lubricating or providing liquidity to their national economies. So as a very brief example of why trade is really important for certain developing countries, if we take the example of Sri Lanka, which has been in a lot of global, economic strife recently, and have been dealing with economic collapse, Sri Lanka has been has specialized in the production of certain commodities over the course of its post-colonial and also colonial history. And these have typically been things such as coconuts, tea, and as well as products and services associated with the tourism industry. So because Sri Lanka has wanted to previously and also contemporaneously build, infrastructure projects or create services for its people or try to develop in a way that Western countries have previously, it has needed money to be able to do this. And most of the expenses and inputs that countries need in order to build things and fund services and so forth are paid for in US dollars. So there's a kind of a long historical political economy reason for the dominance of the US dollar, which we can't really go into today, but needless to say that the US dollar is the major currency of trade. And so countries, if they want to either import things or embark on large infrastructure projects, they need to have US dollars in order to pay for it. And so because a country like Sri Lanka has been attempting to develop over the last 50, 60 years since independence, they needed US dollars to do so. And to be able to earn these, it has sought to trade its commodities on international markets. So it has continued to produce tea, coconuts and other items that Sri Lanka is known to produce, which has been again set in during the days of colonialism in that country. But because it's the primary way that Sri Lanka has been able to basically fund its development, it has had to continue producing and specializing in these types of commodities and then trading them with international partners to gain US dollars to fund development. Now, unfortunately, because of the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, the government has gone into an awful lot of debt, which it now is struggling to repay. We'll talk a little bit more about circuits and mechanisms of debt in the global economy shortly, but Sri Lanka is a contemporary example of a country that has quite a large national debt and is struggling to pay it off. And because of that, it has had to increase production in these commodities and further trade these with other countries in the global economy to be able to receive US dollars, not only to fund its development, but also to pay off its debts. And this is something, we'll come back to and talk a little bit more about shortly. So this is how trade is important in the global economy. Now, with countries specializing in commodities, trading with each other, most mainstream analysts see this as a really positive thing. They see this as ensuring that there's global cooperation between countries, that they trade with each other, and so they become more what we call interdependent, so that each country is dependent on every other country to be able to satisfy their needs. So for instance, Australia, we produce and export things such as iron ore, gas, and certain agricultural products, but we also need to import lots of other products for the citizenry to maintain their quality of life. And so we depend on importing products from China, other Southeast Asian countries, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Europe, and from the Americas to be able to satisfy the kind of quality of life that the citizens in Australia expect. So there's this interdependence between each country. And again, mainstream analysts see this as a profoundly positive thing, and that it increases cooperation and fosters global peace when countries are reliant on one another. We will touch on these assumptions of the global economy in slides coming up, but I just want you to understand that these are kind of the important roles of the state in the global economy at the moment, and some of the related assumptions. We will also come back into more detail about how exactly is the state involved in the global economy in later slides. I mentioned before that another important actor in the global economy is international institutions. I mentioned before that there are a few different international institutions that do have some influence on the global economy, but the two major institutions we'll focus on today are the Bretton Woods institutions, which are otherwise known as the International Financial Institutions, and this is the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. So both the World Bank and the IMF were established following World War II, and they have had a really significant impact on the global economy since they were founded. So to start with the World Bank was originally envisioned to deal with two major issues as an international institution. The first one was to aid in reconstruction following the devastation of World War II. So the World Bank initially helped out some post-war countries in Europe, such as France and Luxembourg, by loaning them money to help their reconstruction from the destruction of World War II. And however, this role was quickly eclipsed by the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan was a program of huge economic aid which came from the United States to help rebuild the European countries. And this was more or less because the United States quickly became fearful of communists taking over a continental Europe as they achieved, victories and integrated countries into the Soviet Union in some European countries following World War II. So the Marshall Plan was to help European countries reconstruct quickly and provide a good quality of life for their citizens so that communism couldn't get a stronghold in European countries. So the World Bank's reconstruction mandate was sidelined initially in the institution's history. It would finally come back to having a strong impact in reconstruction and post-conflict financing, but this would really only occur after the 1990s and into the 2000s. And it's not something that we can really touch on today, but is a main focus of my research. But the second function of the World Bank, which it was given at the end of World War II when it was created, is that of development. So the World Bank is a major leader in development knowledge and practice around the world, and it is probably the ultimate institution in development. So its mandate is to assist countries develop and progress in their economies, and to, in the words of their vision, ensure a world free from poverty. So we'll talk a little bit more about the World Bank's function and influence on the global economy and their ability to meet this developmental mandate shortly, but it's not something that we can go into a huge amount of detail in this seminar. While on the other hand, the International Monetary Fund was also set up at the end of World War II. It was, however, mandated to ensure the stability of the global economy. So like we mentioned in the previous slide and the slide before that, one of the main aspects of the global economy is the trade between countries, which relies also on the exchange of those countries' currencies. So the International Monetary Fund was established to help the seamless trade and flow of these currencies across borders. The main idea of the International Monetary Fund was that it would allow the integration and movement of the global economy after World War II to prevent a relapse in nationalism, which many had thought caused the eruption of World War II. So again, the International Monetary Fund was about ensuring cooperation in the global economy between countries. This role, similar to the World Bank, has changed quite a bit since then, and really after the 1970s, when the formalized system that was established in the wake of World War II that allowed the exchange of currencies at a certain value was basically destroyed, and the IMF for a number of years had no clear function. Since that time, in cooperation with the World Bank, it has also been involved in some aspects of development, and both institutions have infamously used what is called structural adjustment policies in many developing countries over the course of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, and even stretching into the contemporary era. So what I mean by structural adjustment policies is that both the World Bank and the IMF will be approached, for example, by a country, and it's usually always a developing country, who needs economic support and loans because their country is bankrupt or unable to repay its debts. So again, another contemporary example, or the same contemporary example, might be Sri Lanka, but this applies to a huge number of developing countries. So when Sri Lanka has been able to unpay its debts most recently and has faced economic collapse, it has gone to the World Bank and the IMF for loans to help support its economy. This is money that, of course, firstly has to be paid back, but secondly also has strings attached. So the World Bank and the IMF have both functioned to increase the integration of countries into the global economy, and this means following certain gold standard policies that these institutions believe are necessary to increase the prosperity of developing countries. And we'll talk a little bit more about what these policies are later on. So the World Bank and the IMF see their role, and most mainstream analysis also see their role, as one of fostering cooperation. So allowing countries to be increasingly independent with each other, to cooperate and exchange goods on the global economy. And so the World Bank and the IMF see their position as institutions that increase cooperation. However, because of the history of these institutions and how they have applied, again, what I called structural adjustment programs, mainly to developing countries in the so-called global south, many critical analysis have seen the World Bank and the IMF as imposing certain policies on poorer countries who have to accept their help to be able to receive money to continue functioning, either to repay their debts that they have or to provide services and goods for their citizens. So the World Bank has been accused of swooping in on developing countries when they are at their weakest and imposing certain policies that governments of recipient countries have to institute to be able to access their money. And the World Bank and the IMF are really, well, more or less, but since recently have been a one-stop shop for all countries who need financing. Often they can't access any other financing before they accede to the World Bank and IMF's demands. More recently, there have been other regional development banks being created in various parts of the world, but still many of these institutions, as well as commercial banks and other major lenders on the international market, will require countries to agree to World Bank and IMF policies before they can access their money. So these two institutions are really important, not only for ideas of development in the global economy, for integrating states and other actors in the global economy, but they're also very much gatekeepers in the global economy and have been highly influential to develop exactly what the global economy looks like and how it should function. And we'll talk a little bit more about this soon. So I mentioned as well that the role of the government and the state has changed quite a lot in the global economy. And I mentioned before this idea of states being producers of certain specialized commodities, looking to trade these on international markets and fostering interdependence because of this function. So this is a very classical way of looking at the role of states in the global economy, whereas their real function is a lot more nuanced. And we'll try to get at some of these details in this discussion. So following World War II, there was a new kind of global economic order that was established. And with this global economic order, as I mentioned, there were certain institutions that were created, such as the World Bank and the IMF, primarily to foster increased cooperation in countries. And one of the major goals of the post-World War II economic order, besides fostering cooperation internationally between countries, was also to ensure that people, at least of the industrial countries, could expect a progressively better quality of life. Again, the global context at the end of World War II was not only the defeat of the Axis powers and of fascism in Europe, but also the rise of the Soviet Union and communism across the world as a legitimate and threatening political movement to the liberal order status quo. So it was seen as highly important by a lot of global policy elites that they had to provide some kind of stable and good kind of livelihood for their citizens. Because if they didn't, then communist forces and other revolutionary forces might encourage them to rebel against their countries. And so in this context, the so-called social contract that emerged after World War II was one that was defined by what we called Keynesian economics. And Keynesian economics basically refers to, and this is quite a simple explanation, of governments ensuring that there was full employment for its citizens. And again, critically, the citizens of industrial countries and generally the citizens who were white men. So this was generally a social contract at that time for them. And this Keynesian system guaranteed generally full employment, also guaranteed rising wages with increases in productivity, and also increase government spending in the provision of goods and services for its citizens. So previously, before World War II, this was not always the case for governments in industrial countries. They weren't always involved, and even quite rarely involved, in the provision of social services. And so this was a major change in how governments acted in the global economy. So there was a lot of intervention and engagement in not only local, regional, and national economies, but also the international economy, in order to ensure that there was cooperation across borders between countries, and also that the citizens, and of course certain citizens who were deemed politically important, were able to expect an increasing quality of life. So this was the post-World War II social contract based on what we might call a Keynesian global economic order. Now, in the 1970s, there was several different events which put huge amounts of pressure on this economic order, and also changed how the government approached the economy. We can't go into the full details of what occurred across the 1970s, but I can touch on some kind of simple, broad overviews to explain what happened and then, what followed this turbulent decade. So across this era, there was a few major events which catalyzed the increased cost of commodities as kind of the first wave in this turbulent decade. So once commodity prices rose, developing countries were able to, better develop their economies because most of them were still reliant on exporting commodities, as we mentioned earlier. And these are what we call primary commodities. So things like food and other commodities that weren't processed, so didn't need any further manufacturing. So they could just be exported on the international market. The price of these commodities started to increase, and that helped development of post-colonial states. However, one of the commodities that exploded in value was gas and oil, and really especially oil. And at that stage, most industrial progress in not only the large wealthy countries of the so-called global north, but also the development of the countries of the global south was dependent on oil. And the exploding prices of oil ended up crippling the developing countries and also made the government provision of goods and services in the industrial countries much more expensive, and also eventually politically untenable. So it became a lot more difficult for policymakers to maintain the provision of goods and services because of the exploding increase in commodity prices and especially of oil. So this is one of the first processes that started to disrupt the global economy in the 1970s. The other process was the growing strength of what we call finance capital. So finance capital is defined as kind of the money and power of companies and corporations, and especially banks that operate in finance. So in the 1970s, their power, or before the 1970s, their power had been relatively constrained because of the Great Depression in the 1930s. There was various legislative instruments which curtailed their power because unrestricted finance and money flowing between borders was seen as a major catalyst of the Great Depression. And so their power was since constrained. But by the 1970s, various processes had meant that their power and their ability to move money across borders had started to increase. And finance capital not only kind of gets its profits and subsequently political power through being able to move money easily across borders, but also by what we call commodifying uncommodifiable or previously non-commodifiable products. So for instance, a more contemporary example is if you purchase a house, for instance, and you have a mortgage where you have to pay debt to the bank, what the bank can do is package your expected stream of repayment as a financial product and then sell this in financial markets. And this is where other banks or institutional investors or private investors or other actors in finance capital can purchase these expected streams of debt repayment as a product, and then subsequently sell that on to other investors. So this is termed commodifying things that weren't previously a commodity. So in the 1970s, this process of commodification and the increase in the rise of the power of finance capital coincided with vastly increased commodity prices. The third major event occurring at this time was the US-led invasion of Vietnam and the resulting Vietnam War. Because of the Vietnam War, the United States expanded its program of spending greatly. Not only was it trying to ensure full employment for its citizens and provide some kind of level of social services to, again, ensure that people's quality of life was generally improving. And again, this is a certain people's quality of life, mainly the white working class. But not only did they have to maintain this level of expenditure, but also had to buy a huge amount of military gear for and weapons and other armaments to prolongate their war in Vietnam. And so the United States basically had a huge amount of debt to the rest of the world because it had to effectively borrow money to fund its war efforts. And because of this increase in borrowing, the US dollar, which was the primary currency that every other country traded in, as it is still today, started to lose its value. And then countries started to approach the United States and demand that they can convert their holdings of US dollars into gold, which the US mostly stored at that time. And so this basically caused the US government to stop trading the US dollar at a certain price, as it had done previously, which maintained stable global trading conditions. So it stopped doing that. It also said that it would not convert any US dollars to gold, as had been the practice previously. And then this caused interest rates to rise astronomically. So the US dollar increased in strength, interest rates in the United States rose, and this had the effect of encouraging investors and other actors in the global economy to put their money into the United States because it was a much safer place to store their money than other parts of the world at that time. So this had the reciprocal effect of meaning that there was less money in the world for other countries to use, which also meant that it was harder for developing countries to pay back their debt. So this is quite a complex story, which I'm trying to shorten and make very simple. But the main point that I just want to hammer home here is that in the 1970s, the role of the government in the economy became quite untenable because of these interlinked crises. Basically, industrial countries could no longer afford to provide the promises of the post-World War II social contract. And concurrent with this problem was the rise of what we call neoliberalism, which was an idea of how to structure the global economy. So rather than have stable currency exchanges providing a certain guaranteed level of employment for citizens, neoliberalism instead advocated that the market should generally decide how economic resources are allocated and not the government. So the policies associated with neoliberalism, there are a few of them, but mainly it was what we call liberalization, so that there were no borders or tariffs or blockages on capital or money being able to move across borders. So this allowed investors to move their money quicker internationally without cost. So that's the policies of liberalization. Another policy associated with neoliberalism was marketization, where the government or other international bodies sought to create markets in areas where there weren't markets before. A contemporary example of this is the market for trading climate pollution. So this is creating markets where there weren't markets before. And another kind of important policy of neoliberalism at this time was privatization. So a lot of governments in countries around the world owned productive infrastructure and productive instruments where it produced commodities and sold them on the international market. The government owned these, what we call means of production. However, neoliberalism was the idea that private entities and private companies would be more efficient in using these resources and producing commodities. So privatization meant selling these state-owned assets to private people. So this idea of neoliberalism, which has a long and interesting intellectual history, became very important in the 1970s as the post-World War II social contract became less attractive to implement, and neoliberalism became much more attractive, and especially because conservative political forces started winning elections, especially in the 1980s, across the industrial world. So such as very famous good conservative politicians at this time were Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the US and UK respectively. They willfully applied neoliberal policies to their economies, which caused a great loss of employment, increased poverty, a decoupling of productivity from quality of life. So even though productivity may have increased, that didn't mean increased wages for workers as it had done previously, and changed these societies substantially. So this was kind of the early neoliberalism model that started defining the world economy and also the government's position in that world economy. So following the global financial crisis, which is in our contemporary era, and we've skipped forward quite a bit here, neoliberalism has changed quite a bit. So again, very briefly, the global financial crisis was more or less the collapse of the banking and financial sectors because of the commodification that they performed on things that weren't previously commodifiable. Again, I made that example of debt, like someone's debt to pay off their mortgage, that was packaged into something that could be sold to investors. Because of this kind of commodification, which was based on what was called fictitious and highly risky avenues of profit making. When this collapsed like a house of cards, many banks and financial institutions became bankrupt. At this time, governments started to become highly interventionist in the economy, and visibly very interventionist. So they, as many of you may either know from your readings or from parents who lived through this time, governments more or less bailed out banks and financial institutions that were on the verge of collapsing. And they injected trillions of dollars to save these institutions to uphold the global economy, because there was a real risk that the entire edifice of the global economy would collapse. So governments started to intervene a lot more heavily in the economy since the global financial crisis, and mainly for the benefit of not only banks and the financial system, but also for multinational corporations more generally. And even in recent times, during COVID-19, for instance, and even in the last few months, governments around the world have intervened often to protect what are called politically important companies from collapsing. So neoliberalism has changed from its original kind of theoretical outlook to being focused on opening up markets, liberalizing, privatizing, and generally keeping the government out of the economy, to now moving to predominantly the government protecting the economy. And so the role of the government today is one where it doesn't directly produce commodities. It doesn't directly hold ownership in what we call the means of production, but it protects the functioning of markets and will intervene to do so. So in summary, and we've spoken about a lot of aspects of the global economy, we can think of it as a multi-scalar, interconnected system where we not only, trade commodities, but also cooperate and integrate across borders. And just like we mentioned before, this is predominantly a capitalist global economy where the profit motive is the driver of corporations expanding, of trade expanding, and of constant growth. And capitalism in the contemporary era is defined as what we understand as neoliberalism. So, like we mentioned, the idea of neoliberalism has changed somewhat since the 1970s when it first came to prominence, to now being a philosophy and a political program that seeks to not only ensure that there's open borders, free trade, and the kind of power of corporations and finance and banks within the global economy, but also a system where the government does have a strong role in protecting the function of markets more broadly, whether they're local, national, or even international markets. So now that we've spoken at length about the global economy, we're now going to think about, well, how does this system produce inequality? So during the preceding discussion, you may have noticed that a lot of the points that are highlighted about the global economy were ones that kind of hinted at inequalities between nations. So one of the first items of inequality we're going to look at is that between nations. As we mentioned before, a lot of inequalities in nations have stemmed from their colonial history. So, and I won't repeat in detail what I've said, but imperial powers such as England, France, and Spain divided up most of the non-European world amongst themselves and ensured that each of their colonies had a specific purpose in terms of what commodities it produced for the imperial center. And obviously there's a lot more about colonial history which we could touch on, but the establishment of certain countries producing certain commodities is one that is still relatively true today. And again, we can look at any kind of country that has a colonial history and be able to quite clearly see that it has certain commodities that it specializes in, and these specializations are usually very similar to what they were during colonial times. And because of processes of neo-colonialism, these specializations and the position of these countries in the global economy have been maintained. So, and I've spoken a little bit about this with the example of Sri Lanka before, but countries today, if they want to develop, they need to borrow money on the international market to be able to fund infrastructure projects and other development projects, and so they need US dollars to do so. But because obviously the US dollar is controlled by the United States, but also most of the actors in the global economy who can lend US dollars, whether they be the World Bank, the IMF, or commercial banks, are usually located in the Western world. And so countries such as Sri Lanka that need loans must approach them for money. And then to be able to pay back these loans, which usually have quite a high interest rate, they need to then keep earning money in their international trade. And rather than diversify the products that they make, which would take a lot of time, be very expensive, and be difficult to do, they continue exporting and specializing in the same commodities that were prevalent in colonial history. So this is what we call a process of neo-colonialism, where certain relations in the global economy maintain that inequality between nations previously. And this is also really important and something that I haven't emphasized before, because most of the previously colonial countries, such as Sri Lanka, such as Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, countries, Southeast Asia, Central Americas, and so forth, they generally produce what we call primary commodities. So these are commodities that can be either grown or mined and then shipped out overseas. So this might be, gold, for instance, even though it's quite a high value one, but also wheat, maize, coffee, and especially other agricultural products. So these are primary commodities. Now, primary commodities, they fluctuate in value, and have fluctuated in value throughout history. So in some years, coffee prices might be really high, and so developing countries are able to earn more money from selling these highly priced commodities. But then in other years, these commodities might be very low in price. And so then again, developing countries struggle to be able to earn money from their sale. Now, this is very different to what we call manufactured or processed commodities, where items such as, for instance, laptops, phones, computers, other manufactured items have consistently increased in value across time. So developing countries who don't produce manufactured commodities and who rely on primary commodities have a disadvantage in the global economy because of the fluctuation in prices of those primary commodities. Whereas industrial countries and some highly developed countries, they produce either things like manufactured goods or complex financial products, which have consistently increased in value. So when developing countries try to earn more money, they have to produce more and more of these primary commodities, which have a relative value at any particular point in the global economy, which can be very difficult. And then obviously industrial countries have manufactured commodities and other complex products that they can sell on international markets for a much higher price. Another and related reason that there's inequalities between nations is what we call the position of these countries in the global political economy. And like we mentioned before, because certain developing countries produce primary commodities that they send to more developed countries, we say that they have a peripheral position in the global political economy. So if you imagine developing countries on the outside of this political economy circle, and then more developed industrial countries such as Anglo-Saxon countries and continental Europe and so forth are in the center, they receive predominantly the most, the highest portion of these primary commodities. And because of the points we made previously, this position in the global political economy is maintained, where developing countries basically sell their products to developed countries and also have to pay their debts back normally to developed countries as well. So there's a definitive power imbalance between developed and developing countries in the global economy. There are processes which have changed the strength of this power imbalance somewhat in recent years. And one of them is the political cooperation and alignment of large highly developed countries called BRICS, where Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have joined somewhat together in a more or less cooperative political body and have sought to increase cooperation amongst themselves to increase their power in the global economy. So there are movements to fight this power differential in the global economy. But because of the processes we've already discussed, this is very, very difficult. So another reason why there's inequalities in between nations, and again, it's all linked to what we've discussed so far, is that crises tend to predominantly affect developing countries. And when I say crises, this might mean economic crises, political crises, military crises, and now ecological crises. Because countries that are developing, like we mentioned before, need money to be able to fund their development, they get into debt. And I want you to remember the example of Sri Lanka that I mentioned before, which applies again to a host of different developing countries. Now, at some point, a lot of developing countries, because of various political economy processes throughout the global economy, struggle to repay this debt. And so then they enter a period of economic crisis where they can't repay their debts. They can't then fund services to their citizens, and then risk going into economic collapse and bankruptcy. So when that occurs, they then need urgently a large amount of money to be injected into their economy. And like I mentioned before, they often turn to and are forced to turn to international financial institutions, so the IFIs, being predominantly the World Bank and the IMF. So when these countries receive help from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, these IFIs say that, yes, we'll give you money to help your economy out, and we'll loan you, it might be $10, $15 billion, for instance. But for us to do so, you have to make changes in your national economy, which we think are best practice and will help you grow in the future. So the World Bank and IMF present their policy prescriptions as benign, helpful and necessary changes to global economies, but often these are strongly and ideologically linked to the neoliberal consensus that these economies must open up their borders to the movement of money. They have to, privatize state assets, and they have to create markets within their countries, amongst other processes. But the net effect of a lot of these changes is that it makes it easier for foreign multinational corporations to be able to enter these countries, buy up either infrastructure or properties or other means of productions quite cheaply, and then be able to dominate the economies of these developing countries. It also allows money to be moved in and out of the country quite easily, which also means that these countries can suddenly lose a lot of money if international investors aren't confident in their continued economic capacities. So the lending programs of the World Bank and the IMF tend to reinforce the position of these developing countries in the global economy, which is one of inequality between countries and domination by industrial countries. And interlinked in all of these crises and the various position of countries in the global political economy is the issue of debt. And again, this is unfortunately something we can't go in a lot today, and it is something we've already touched on, but generally developing countries have to repay debt to the industrial countries or banks and financial institutions located in industrial countries. And so there is a net transfer of wealth from developing countries in the periphery to the developed countries in the center of the global economy. So this also makes it very hard for these developing countries to further their development when they're constantly in debt to primarily Western creditors. So now let's move on to the other major inequality in the global economy, and this is inequalities between people. Again, this is a very complex topic, which we'll only really be able to provide a brief overview of. So one of the inequalities between people is divided by what we describe as class. And so this kind of radiates from the political and economic issue of who owns things in society. So I mentioned before that countries and states, they produce commodities to sell in the world market, as well as multinational corporations produce things to sell. So these countries or multinational corporations and their owners, they own or have control of instruments or infrastructure that create and produce these commodities. And like I mentioned before, we call these things the means of production. So because of various historical processes and a lot of political confrontation across the course of the last few hundred years, the owners of the means of production who have the ability to generate, to earn, capital and profit on the world market are a small number of people who own these things. So, for example, you might think of billionaires and millionaires who own companies and corporations who are able to claim most of the profit or the product of these companies for themselves. So because of this process, which has been going on for at least the last 300 years, there has been more or less a small number of people across the world who own the vast majority of the productive processes of our societies. So even in the last few years, there's been a lot of research about increasing inequality on lines of class, where the elites own and enjoy a huge amount of the world's produce, whereas working class people and people who have to earn money to live don't own anywhere near as much. So research has demonstrated, for example, this class-based inequality has been getting worse and worse, where 10 of the richest people in the world own as much wealth as approximately the poorest 40% of the world. So, the same as billions of people. So these inequalities between people divided on what we call class lines is very much based on historical and political processes that have defined who owns things in society, thus who gets to direct production and reap the benefits of production itself. Again, this is a very simple explanation on a very complex topic, but I just want you to think about the inequalities between class that you probably even see every day in your life, between people who need to work for a living and those who don't. The second way that inequalities between people are engendered is how we value work and how we value what activities we do every day. So when we talk about work, most people think about the social process where we maybe go to an employer, we might do work on a computer, we might make products, and we might provide services as a part of our job, which is what we consider work, as something that we also get a wage for. So this work is valued in the economy in terms of that there's a monetary value put on it. So how much you produce in your work is valuable and exploitable by the corporation that you work for, and that earns that corporation money. And so it's something that work can be measured, it can be quantified, it can be sold. Now, there's obviously a lot of work in general society that isn't analyzed or accepted in the same way. So what we call reproductive work, which is processes of household labor, of rearing children, of cultural learning, and other non-paid work processes. This is reproductive labor. And generally, this labor is not valued, it's not given a wage, and it's often not considered work. And predominantly, the people that generally tend to this work, whether, again, it's household labor, where it's caring for children, maybe caring for elderly people, or providing emotional support, is usually conducted by women. And it's often always done for free. And so this central factor means that women's labor is valued much less than men's generally. And so the work that women generally do is much more than men, because they also have to often earn a wage as well, while also tending to household reproductive labor. And so their work is valued less. And so this also impacts on their political and economic power in society, and is one of the central reasons why gender inequalities persist across societies throughout the world. And this goes back again to capitalist processes which value and aim for the continued increase in profit. And because reproductive labor does not turn a profit, because we don't quantify it, because we don't value it, then capitalism fundamentally does not value women's labor. And so this is one of the reasons we have inequalities in that domain. And of course, this is not always a simple division between just men and women, but reproductive labor can be performed by anyone at all. And also this impacts how anyone's labor is valued and is responsible for fundamental inequalities between people. A really important part of the global political economy is thinking about, well, whose life is valued? And this is closely associated with whose work is valued, but this talks more about racial inequalities and ethnic inequalities between people. This is unfortunately a topic like the others, we can't go into a huge amount of details about in this seminar, but inequalities between people is also engendered by the global economy. As I mentioned before, a lot of the historical ways that the economy has been organized, either through the post-World War II social contract, where white men were predominantly looked after in industrial countries following World War II, as well as more contemporary developments of the global economy, where certain countries have been kept in the peripheries of the global economy because of things like specialization and interdependence, which we've discussed before, which are due to remnants of colonialism and neocolonialism. This has historically meant that certain people defined by their ethnicity or race have not been valued as highly or even seen as a normative person in the global economy. So just to make this a little bit clearer, in the post-World War II social contract in the United States, and as well as in Australia and other industrial countries, there's white working men who were guaranteed full employment and guaranteed social benefits, whereas people of color and women were not seen to be citizens in the same way, and therefore could not demand or expect the same level of provisions from the state. And this has continued or has historically influenced the development of capitalism since, where Black and other ethnic bodies have not been valued in exactly the same way as white bodies in generally Anglo-American industrial countries. This is, again, a topic that we can't go into a lot of detail here, but it's really important to understand that the global economy also influences inequalities in terms of race between people. Now, many of these processes that we've discussed so far mean that generally a certain type of political constituency has been protected in the global economy. And just like I mentioned before, the contemporary neoliberal era is, I guess, characterized by state and international institutional intervention into the global economy to protect markets. And because the major operators in markets today are multinational corporations, banks, financial institutions. It is these companies and the people who own them who are generally protected in the global economy. So when banks, for instance, lose money and get into financial trouble, the government bails them out through huge amounts of liquidity or money injection into those institutions or those corporations, which maintains the power, privilege, and wealth of those who own these companies. But then quite often, the people who have taken out loans from the banks or who have mortgages with those banks, they are not similarly protected, and they might lose their house or they might lose their savings, where the owners of these corporations don't lose anything. So in the global economy today, there is politically and economically defined important constituencies who are protected. And these are generally the owners of the means of production, the owners of corporations, and other politically important entities. So this also contributes to inequalities between people. So now to go back to this question of how does the global economy produce inequality, as you can see, it's a very complicated, intertwined, and difficult process to communicate in a simple and in a quick way. But we need to be able to understand how the global economy in its processes of trade, specialization, and production contribute to not only furthering inequalities between states, which, as I have shown in this seminar, have occurred because of not only colonial and neo-colonial history, but also the position of these countries in the global economy, which is often defined by crisis and debt, but also the inequalities between people, which have been framed classically on class, gender, and race lines. So this functioning of the global economy, even though it's presented as one that fosters cooperation, engenders increased growth and a cosmopolitan society, actually does inherently produce inequalities and contradictions. And this is because of who owns the productive capacities in nations and within the global economy, whose work counts, whose body counts, and who are defined as citizens, and also who is protected in the global economy. So these processes are really important to understand that the global economy, even though it's presented as something that is benign, is a kind of totalizing process that can have a really strong impact on inequalities between people and states. So now we're going to touch on the final learning objective of this seminar. And at the end, I'll also try to do a small recap of what we've spoken about so far in this seminar. But the last learning objective is, what is the role of artificial intelligence? So artificial intelligence has increased in kind of discursive popularity, but also material popularity in the last few years, as more and more technologies have been produced that have seemed to herald the beginning of an era of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, for the purposes of this discussion, can be taken very broadly, whether that is killer robots as described here in this picture, or even technologies such as ChatGPT that automate activities that humans had to manually do previously. So we can maybe understand a definition of artificial intelligence being some machine or robot mediated a machine or robot mediated performance of activities that humans used to do. So this usually refers to automation and other similar processes that artificial intelligence seem to be equipped to do. So keeping that definition of artificial intelligence in mind, we need to ask ourselves, based on the previous discussions that we've had about what is the global economy and how does it produce inequality, what's the role of artificial intelligence here? How will it change the global economy? How will it change the inequalities within the global economy? What can artificial intelligence do? So this is what we're going to try to address in the last part of this seminar. So the proponents of introducing artificial intelligence more generally have rested usually on the benefits to what we call the macroeconomy that artificial intelligence can bring. So the macroeconomy refers to a number of factors that I've actually mentioned quite frequently throughout the seminar so far, but haven't given a definitive name to it. The macroeconomy is what can be described as the broad parts of the economy that can be quantified and measured. So these are things such as economic growth, it might be GDP, it might be inflation, levels of unemployment. These measures form the basis of the macroeconomy. So the larger parts of the economy that we can observe, which we can quantify, and that we can measure. So as we mentioned before, the current system of global economy we have, which is one of a neoliberal capitalist system, focuses on further expanding markets, increasing profits, while protecting those markets, whether it might be from radical politics, ecological collapse, violence, or other parts of, or other kind of processes of instability. So this neo-capitalist system that we have thrives on growth. So proponents of artificial intelligence have positively looked at applying artificial intelligence to production processes to increase production and therefore increase economic growth as something that can positively support the capitalist global economy. So this is one of the major macroeconomic changes that they would expect in artificial intelligence, that we can increase production, make it more efficient, and broaden growth so that corporations who employ artificial intelligence can reap greater profits. So this is the macroeconomic basis of artificial intelligence, and many see these innovations as being inherently a very positive thing for the global economy. However, we have to also think about, well, how will this influence the inequality between people, which are already present in the global economy, as well as the inequality between nations that also is something we can see in the global economy today? Because any kind of technological introduction of technology or a technological fix or some kind of technology is never value neutral, and it's never applied on a blank canvas. So when we start thinking about artificial intelligence, we shouldn't get into the habit of thinking about artificial intelligence as what we might call a deus ex machina, or as something that can suddenly intervene on the global economy and make things better for everyone, without understanding the mechanisms and the processes that underlie the global economy. Because any technology that we apply to the current social totality or the current global economy will be impacted and influenced by, and also influence the processes that already exist in the global economy. So one of the processes that we've spoken about at length is the inequality between people. So we need to think about, well, how can artificial intelligence, when applied to the global economy, influence the inequality between people? Now, going back to the positive macroeconomic argument made for the introduction of artificial intelligence, that it will increase production through efficiencies and increase growth. This usually means, whether it's said explicitly or not, that productive jobs can be taken by AI. So, for instance, this has already happened quite famously in factories where things like cars and other technologies are made, where previously in the 1960s and the 1970s, it was, working people would put these large manufactured commodities together, like cars. They would put all of the individual parts of it together, mostly by hand, with maybe some assistance of machinery, of course. However, since that time, especially during the 80s and the 1990s, that industry has turned more towards robotic mechanisms to make that process of creating cars more efficient. And this has meant that those companies have been able to lay off a lot of workers because they've been able to get robots who can replace their jobs. So when we think about the further introduction of artificial intelligence, we have to kind of consider, where will these efficiency gains be made in production to increase corporations' profits? And normally it will be through reducing the amount of money they have to spend on labor, which is the major cost of most corporations around the world. So if they can introduce artificial intelligence to cut those costs, then it will help their bottom line and therefore help their profit making. Now, if we introduce artificial intelligence, this will obviously then cause a lot of people to lose their jobs. There might not be the programs and even the opportunities to be able to retrain people who lose their jobs from artificial intelligence, so that they can get new jobs to be able to provide for themselves and their families and communities around them. So this could therefore increase poverty and further increase the discrepancy between the rich and the people who have to continue to work for a living. So this is one element of inequality between people that might be furthered by the impact of artificial intelligence, which is mainly through the loss of jobs. The only way really that the global economy could reduce this likelihood, or at least reduce the impact of people losing jobs from broadly introduced artificial intelligence across the global economy, is to institute some kind of baseline living guaranteed payment for everyone around the world, which politically is highly unlikely. So unfortunately, one of the impacts of artificial intelligence in the global economy might lead to job losses, which would then further inequality between people. And one of the kind of interesting things, or interesting aspects of the introduction of artificial intelligence into the global economy, is to think about how it might be able to make the lives of people who perform reproductive labor much easier. So technological changes have helped the kind of carrying out of reproductive labor quite substantially in previous history, where, for instance, everyday items that you might own at home, such as a dishwasher, as a technology fix, has saved a lot of time in reproductive labor. So there is an argument that possibly artificial intelligence could be employed in homes to reduce the burden of reproductive labor that people have to perform. Obviously, it can't most likely won't be able to replace all reproductive labor that is currently carried out to ensure that we can continue living. And it might be able to reduce a substantial amount of that, which many people have argued that might reduce predominantly women's burden on carrying out this reproductive labor, and therefore decrease inequality between genders. So this is very much a potentiality of the introduction of artificial intelligence, but we also have to think about who could access this artificial intelligence. So very poor people, or even working class people in countries across the world, most likely won't be able to afford to pay for artificial intelligence in their home to replace the labor that's put into reproductive labor processes. And so generally, as the global economy currently stands, it will be the wealthy and the elites who could actually afford to bring in artificial intelligence into the home to conduct reproductive labor. So this is, again, something that might further the inequalities between people. So this has only really touched on a few ways that the artificial intelligence might change or influence inequalities between people in the global economy. But it's important to consider the already existing inequalities between people and how the introduction of artificial intelligence might influence that. Now, the second inequalities that we see frequently with the global economy, and as what we've discussed extensively, is the inequality between nations. So once again, just to recap on this, the inequalities between nations within the global economy is very much down to historical processes which have occurred under colonialism and continued after colonialism, which has meant certain countries that are in the peripheries and have to supply the primary commodities to the core industrial countries who mainly export manufactured goods and other high-value services. So this inequality between nations is something that exists in the global economy. And we need to think about, well, how will the introduction of artificial intelligence impact upon this? So if we consider what countries might manufacture, the requirements or technologies or processes that are involved in creating artificial intelligence, it most likely will be the current countries who enjoy monopolies in high technology goods. So this includes industrial countries and also highly developed countries such as China and even parts of India as well. So these countries might be able to, for example, produce artificial intelligence, or at least have the technologies to contribute to the production of artificial intelligence. And so for these countries, they will be able to sell, presumably, these highly valued products of artificial intelligence on the international market for a high amount of money. And again, this will most likely be far more than what developing countries could achieve in the exporting of primary commodities, such as agricultural products. And so the development of artificial intelligence in the global economy will most likely further those inequalities which are already existing between nations, which are defined by, what do countries produce and how they produce them. So industrial countries and highly technologically equipped countries most likely be the first to produce artificial intelligence, which means that they will be able to exploit the benefits of selling that artificial intelligence on the international market. It's also important to note at this stage that when we think about artificial intelligence, it's not only the products themselves, which corporations are currently producing and will continue to produce in the future, but also the intellectual property rights of this technology. So for example, a recent artificial intelligence technology, ChatGPT, is itself an artificial intelligence product, but it's also a intellectual property where the company that produces ChatGPT have a license and a legally secured ability and exclusivity to produce that technology, which other companies are prohibited from just directly copying. So the first country, or corporations within countries that can make artificial intelligence, will most likely have a relative monopoly on that new technology initially, so that they will then be able to increase their wealth and therefore power in the global economy before other countries can catch up. And we've already seen this occur throughout history in the global economy, and even relatively recent innovations such as the computer and the phone have been able to propel the profits of certain corporations through the sale of these products, but also because of the protection afforded to their monopoly on these products by intellectual property law. So it's important to think about intellectual property and how also that fits into artificial intelligence. So it's not just about the products themselves, but also the licensing and monopolization of these products, which can further inequality between nations. So now this is one of possibly two aspects that of how AI can further inequality between nations, where industrial nations can produce AI to sell it on the international market and earn substantial sums of money. The other way that this could further inequality between nations is that the countries and people within countries and corporations within countries that can afford artificial intelligence will most likely be the industrial center. So again, the highly developed technologically developed countries will most likely be able to not only afford artificial intelligence, but also adapt it for their current systems. And if these countries are able to increase their relative growth, their GDP output, which will further their wealth and therefore power in the global economy, this will also drive further inequality between developed and developing nations. Because not only will developed countries be able to sell AI technology, but they'll also be most likely the ones who can afford it in substantial amounts, which will mean that the macroeconomic benefits of these technologies will be more exploitable in the global core or the highly industrialized countries. And a related process of the increased employment of artificial intelligence in rich industrial countries, which is linked to our previous point of increasing inequalities between people, because a high amount of jobs will be lost in the industrial countries from the hypothetical introduction of artificial intelligence on a wide scale, then it is highly likely that companies who cannot afford to buy artificial intelligence and also to compete with other companies who employ artificial intelligence would also have to most likely relocate to other countries where they can employ people at a much cheaper rate in developing countries than developed countries to be able to remain competitive with companies in the industrial countries who can employ artificial intelligence. So again, just to make that point a little bit simpler, if companies are able to, or certain companies able to employ artificial intelligence in industrial countries and shed their workforce, the companies also in that same country who can't afford to bring in artificial intelligence to remain competitive might have to move to developing poorer countries to decrease their labor costs, just as if they had AI, to remain competitive to those countries who can employ artificial intelligence. So this not only will further inequalities between people within countries, but also further inequalities between nations, as highly profitable and wealthy corporations are able to exploit artificial intelligence, where the corporations that aren't able to might have to move offshore, which will to poorer countries, which will then further increase inequality. So the introduction of artificial intelligence is obviously something in its early stages, but we need to always think about the introduction of any technology in the global economy in a critical way, as something that is not just applied to a blank canvas, but is applied to a context of already occurring economic processes and factors which have contributed to the global economy we see today, which is one marked by deep inequality between people, as well as substantial inequality between nations. So just to summarize this learning objective of what is the role of artificial intelligence, the short answer is that the role of artificial intelligence will most likely be to continue the inequalities that already exist in the global economy. Although it might technically strengthen the macroeconomic indicators of the global economy, and further kind of the neoliberal capitalist model of the economy, it most likely will also contribute to further inequalities if it is just applied without any further reforms, protections, or anything else done to cushion the potential impacts of the introduction of artificial intelligence. And this just goes to show the importance of thinking about, well, what is the global economy, what inequalities exist, because that will help us understand the further introduction of technologies and different processes into the global economy. So that is more or less the kind of three major learning objectives that we had to focus on in this seminar. And I'll just quickly wrap up what we've discussed so far today. And I also want to thank you for your attention over the course of the seminar, because I know it's a lot of very complex information that we've had to deal in quite broad, simple strokes. But I hope that you've been able to learn something about not only the global economy, but also the inequalities perpetuated by the global economy, and then how artificial intelligence might influence these. So the global economy, as we've discussed, is something which is multiscalar, which goes between international, national, regional, and local levels, which is also deeply interconnected. And it's a totality which involves a whole range of actors across the globe, whether it's individuals, corporations, international institutions, and states, who generally engaged in the global economy to trade commodities and goods and other processes. So we've described how this global economy functions, the role of these various actors within the global economy, and also how that has changed over time to birth the kind of present neoliberal capitalist economy that we know today, which is focused generally on expanding the reach of what we call capital, or the reach of money and power across the world, to open up markets, to privatize assets, to ensure the benefits and the protection of corporations throughout the world. This is how we understand the neoliberal capitalist contemporary era today. And we then spoke about, well, how does this global economy impact on the inequalities between people? And we divided, the inequalities within the global economy, and we divided this between inequalities between people and inequalities between states. And we spoke about how the inequalities between people has been engendered by the global economy through the lenses of class, gender, and race, and also how the global economy has perpetuated inequalities between nations that have also been fostered since the colonial era, and how some of these colonial processes have still been perpetuated by the current contemporary global economy. And finally, we closed off by discussing the role of artificial intelligence in the global economy and how it might have an influence on these factors. And the most important point I wanted to just communicate in this last section and the last learning objective is that technological fixes, whether that's artificial intelligence, technological solutions to climate change, or other technologies that promise to fix things, that they are not applied on a blank canvas, that there's already existing histories, contexts, and inequalities in the global economy especially, which will influence how they are applied and how they are used. So I hope this seminar has been helpful and that you've taken something away from it. And thank you very much for tuning in and for letting me speak to you today. Thank you very much.